Hi, I'm Helen from Helen Kennedy Designs, and today I'd like to show you how to make these adorable little pumpkins. We're going to be working as flat. Each pumpkin takes about 30 to 40 minutes to complete, so you can quite quickly make your own little pumpkin patch using different weights and slightly different colours of yarn. Let's get our tools together. So I've got together my supplies for my pumpkin. I've got my knitting yarn. This is a chunky knitting yarn, and I'm using 5.5mm knitting needles. These might be a touch too big. I'm just going to try it and see, because you want quite a thick fabric so that the stuffing doesn't show through. So 5 to 5.5, but we'll try it with these, see how we go. And then I've got 2 needles. I've got a yarn needle with a nice blunt end and a curve on it, which is really good for picking up your stitches and doing your seaming. And I've got a pointed needle, and this is really good for when you have to go through the stuffing at the end. So you need a pointed needle, and really if you've got a longer one than this, so much the better, especially if you're making a bigger pumpkin. For the tiny pumpkins this is great, but for a bigger pumpkin it gets a bit awkward. You need some scissors for cutting your yarn tails, some fast tack glue or some kind of glue so that you can glue in your little stalk. And the stalk is just simply a little bit of dead wood off the bottom of my hedge, and it's about an inch long because I'm going to make a slightly bigger pumpkin. I usually, to be fair, choose this once I've made the pumpkin and see what size it comes out, but for the purpose of this video I've already gone ahead and got it. And then of course some stuffing for stuffing your pumpkin. There's a full list of what you need in the description below. So let's start by looking at how to knit this pumpkin flat. Now, when you make a seam in your knitting, when you're knitting something like a pumpkin, it doesn't matter what it looks like on the inside, it matters what it looks like on the outside. And because edge stitches in knitting are often untidy, I like to leave a full stitch that's going to be essentially wasted with the seam in order to get a nice finish. So when I'm going to do knit 2, purl 2, I'm going to cast on 22 stitches. So I leave a long yarn tail of about 8 to 12 inches because we're going to use that for some of our sewing up and bits and bobs when we make our pumpkin. I make it so that the slip knot is tightened using the yarn tail, and I just do a simple knitted cast on. I like the knitted cast on because it leaves some loops on the edge of your knitting which are really useful for picking up later. So just go into your slip knot as if to knit, pull your loop up and then pop it onto your needle. It doesn't really matter whether you twist like this to do your cast on or you just put it in here, as long as you're consistent. You just want to get your stitches cast on. So I'll meet you when I've done that. So here's my 22 stitches cast on, and now we're going to work the right side, knit 2, purl 2. My cast on's a little bit tight and acrylic yarn is a little bit stiff to work with, but that's all we need for a pumpkin. We don't need expensive yarns to make our little pumpkin patch. So you can use any yarn scraps, you can double up your yarn to make it thicker if you want to make a bigger pumpkin. And what I really like about this pattern is that you can make a pumpkin pretty quickly in about 30 minutes, and that means that you can make a number of pumpkins and have a little patch, all of different shapes and sizes and with slightly different coloured yarns. And I think together they look really lovely. And they make a great gift as well, because they really are quite quick to make. So that's me. I have nearly finished my row. So we're finishing with a knit 2, and then we are going to turn our work over. And wherever we've got this purl bump, we're going to purl, and wherever it looks like a knit stitch, we're going to knit, so that we're essentially doing a ribbing, a 2x2 ribbing. And I'll meet you when I have finished this row. So that's 2 rows complete. So now what we want to do is keep working those 2 rows until we have a patch of fabric that's slightly shorter than it is wide. So I'm going to go ahead and make that, and I'll join you when I'm ready to start finishing off my pumpkin. So here we are. I have finished my little bit of fabric. I timed it and it took me 17 minutes to finish this off. I've done 20 rows. So my pumpkin's going to be reasonably tall. If you wanted it a little bit flatter and squishier as opposed to taller for a sort of similar circumference, then you could knit a couple less rows. But this is fine. I want a patch of pumpkins. I don't care too much about the size and shape. I want them all to be a little bit different. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take about 20 inches of yarn tail and we're going to snip our yarn. And we're going to thread our yarn onto a blunt tapestry needle. And then using our blunt tapestry needle, we're going to slip in purlwise and just pull the stitches off. So no bind off for this, just take the live stitches onto your needle, and every so often you'll need to pull them through and do that to the end. It's pretty quick and simple. I like the simplicity of this pumpkin because we don't want to spend too much time and energy. There we go. So we have pulled through all of the stitches, so you can cinch it in like that. Now, when you look at your piece of fabric, you've got 2 knit stitches on each end, and you can see here that this column of stitches is quite tidy, and this column, which is your edge stitch, which is pretty untidy. So we're actually going to completely lose this stitch, and that's why I cast on an extra 2 stitches, one at the beginning and one at the end of the fabric, because we're going to lose them. And what I like to do is to use the yarn tail from the cast on edge. So I've taken the needle off where I've cinched in there and done my bind off by taking up my live stitches. And now I'm going to put my blunt tapestry needle onto the yarn tail that forms my cast on. And then what we want to do is match our stitches. So you want to find your first stitch here and your first stitch on the other side. Okay, and we're going to go between this row and this row of stitches. Okay, so what we're looking for are these little bands between the stitches. Okay, so go ahead and find the first one and take your needle through it on one side, and then find the first one on the other side. Oops, missed it. That'll be right by the bind off. And then just work your way up one by one. So that's the next one up on this side. Pick the next one up on the other side. Next one up on the right. Next one up on the left. Don't need to pull too tightly at the minute. We'll be zippering it up. Make sure you don't skip one. It can be quite easy to skip one. If you do that, you won't be nicely aligned. So just take a moment to look properly where your stitches are, and then when you've done a few stitches, what you can do is simply pull on this yarn really tightly. This is a mattress stitch, and it will pull those 2 columns of stitches right together and they're nicely aligned. Then simply keep working up the column of stitches, just slipping your yarn under those bars one at a time all the way up. It's a really nice tidy way of joining your work. And you can see then that what we're creating is 2 knit stitches just like we have elsewhere on our pattern, so that our seam won't really show. Obviously, when you seam a piece of knitting like this, you're always going to have some telltale sign that you've seamed, okay? And that's just life. But if it's easy for you to knit flat and you can't knit in the round, then this is totally fine. This is a pumpkin, okay? This is not your, best sweater or something. So I'm just going to finish my seam and I'll show you when I get to the end. So I've come to my last few stitches. Although we tightened up here, I've loosened it off a little bit. We've still got our yarn tail attached, so we can do that. And that enables me to finish off these last few stitches right up to where we have found those stitches off. If you get a little bit out of sync or it's a little bit tidy under here, this is going to be the very bottom of your pumpkin. There we go. Now, when you have sort of pulled down on this yarn, just give it a little stretch because we're going to be stuffing our pumpkin. But what I hope you can see now, I'm going to zoom out a little bit, is we've created this seamed section and it's just like a sort of knitted section, so it's not really very visible. So we're going to cinch up the end of our pumpkin now, and I want to do this inside out. So I'm going to thread my yarn onto my blunt needle and pass it into the middle of the pumpkin and up through, and then I'm going to turn my pumpkin inside out. And this is because we want to be able to sew this together, but we don't want it to show. And of course, course, because we've knitted flat, we've got our seam inside. So all we need to do now is I just catch some of the live stitches again, a bit willy-nilly really, and pull my yarn tail through and then really cinch it tight. So you've got this tight loop and just go round. I go round a couple of times. So now I'm going to go back through that hole onto the right side and turn my pumpkin the right way out. And so there we've got this little sort of pocket of knitting. And we're going to stuff the pumpkin. Exciting, because it's going to take shape now. So just take a little bit of toy stuffing and pop it inside your pumpkin. And you can kind of change the shape by how stiffly packed you have your pumpkin. You know, it doesn't need to be much, it's quite soft. So I leave mine quite soft because it then means it's quite squishy and I can adjust it as I like. Now what we're going to do is finish off the top end. And what we want to do for this is go through the middle, and it's really hard to go through the middle straight with a bent blunt needle. This shouldn't really be a surprise to anybody. So I am swapping onto my sharp needle, and what I'm going to do is go straight through the middle, and I'm going to come up here. Watch you don't poke your fingers. You can lie it down on a table like I am and pull it through. Now it's going right through the middle of the stuffing, and you want that because it's actually going to form an anchor as part of your pumpkin. Now as you're looking at your pumpkin, if you think it hasn't got quite enough stuffing in, I think mine might be a little bit soft, then you can pop a bit more in, do any little adjustments, and then we're going to finish off the top edge, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit for you. So I'm going to start where I've got my seam, just because it's a good place to start. And I'm going to pick up those loops with my needle. And I'm just going to sort of keep picking them up from the back to front, or front to back, it doesn't really matter. But just pick those loops up. Try and get them all. Doesn't matter if you miss one. And just do that all the way around. And you can see why a blunt needle is useful for this, because you don't snag your yarn and stab your fingers. And then just get the last few. You might need to sort of hold the edge of your... It's easier if you can hold the edge of your knitting, just because it doesn't wriggle away from you. But if you can't, and then just catch the first one again. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then pull your yarn through. Now at this point, have a little feel of the pumpkin and whether you decide. I think my pumpkin simply hasn't got enough stuffing in it. I'll show you. So when I cinch it down a bit, it's all a bit... It doesn't bow out. It's a bit of a soft looking pumpkin, so I'm actually going to just open that slightly and pop a bit more in, so you can adjust as you go along. Okay, this doesn't have to be critical at the beginning. So now you can see when I squish it a bit more, it's sort of bowing out a bit, not here, and I want it to bow out and be chunky, so I'm just going to pop a bit more stuffing. It's quite a big pumpkin actually compared to my others, but it's a good size for demonstrating. So I think that'll do. Pumpkins are uneven shapes, they're not always perfect. So I am now cinching that yarn tail really in, and I give mine a little roll because I think that can help even things out a bit. There we go. And you want your fabric to be reasonably thick, otherwise you're going to see straight through your pumpkin. So I think probably this was as big a needle as I should go. I might even size down a needle because it's a little bit open there. So don't be afraid to go with a needle that you think, a knitting needle size that you think is actually a bit small for your yarn, because you do want to create a thick fabric. So now we've got our yarn tail here. I am going to put it back onto our pointy needle. We're going to pull it hard, and we're not going to worry too much about getting this hole too tight, because what we want is somewhere to put our little stalk, and it can be quite useful to have a little gap there. So we're just going to pick up a little bit just to make sure that we've finished off enough, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go directly through, but what we're going to try and do is come out of that, or very close to that hole at the bottom. Can you see that? I've come out in the middle of that hole, and then we're going to pull our needle through. It does take some work because you've got some stuffing and things in there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to catch a little bit of that bottom there. So we're not just going straight back in the hole. We want to catch a bit of the knitting, and then we're going to come back up to the top. There you can see I've come right out of that hole, and I'm going to pull that up. Then what you're going to do is just grab a little bit of that edge, give it a pull so you can feel it's firm, and pull your yarn tail through, and then pull up and then tighten. And you can see what that does is to basically cinch your work from top to bottom, and that creates your pumpkin shape. So you need to go up and down a few times to make it nice and secure, and each time you do so you want to come out close to the sort of central hole and make sure that you include a little bit of the edge of the seam of the pumpkin so that you're actually anchoring onto something. And if the first time you did it wasn't quite tight enough, that's okay, because you can do it another time and make it tighter and tighter and tighter. So you can choose how sort of tight or flat you want your pumpkin to be. And I like mine quite sort of flattened out, to be honest. I have made some slightly taller ones. And so if you wanted it taller, you just don't pull as tightly when you're doing this. Okay, you can see I've pulled nice and tightly. And now I've got my pumpkin shape. That's it. So then I'm just going to tie off my yarn tail up at the top here. And remember, you're not really going to see this because we're going to be putting our stalk in. So we don't have to worry about having it, beautiful and tidy. So here we are, that's our finished pumpkin, and I like to have this bit where it really goes deep down into the pumpkin as the top of my pumpkin, and this as the bottom of my pumpkin. I've got a little bit of a yarn tail hanging out there, so I'm just going to sort of tuck that away. There you go, it doesn't show. And now what we're going to do is glue in our little stalk, and this is why it's quite useful still to have a little bit of a gap in there, because it's nice to sort of push the stalk into it. So remember, we left a little bit of a hole in there, didn't pull our sewing in too tightly, and that makes it really useful to put your stalk in, and then it can stand quite upright. So I sort of decide how I'm going to have it, and then I get some fast tack glue and I just put a blob of it on the end there and then glue it into my pumpkin. And there we have it, your completed pumpkin. So this is the pumpkin we've just made in chunky weight yarn. You can see it's the granddaddy of the patch because these are made in lighter weight yarns. If you'd like to knit these teeny tiny little pumpkins in the round, click the link in the description below for the free pattern. For now, happy pumpkin knitting.